What's it been like for you starting a YouTube channel over the last few years where we live in a country that has always had a problem with Marxists and socialists, and even now with a conservative leader with a libertarian deputy PM, the wokeness never really goes away?
Yeah, well, I think actually the experience shows that the actual average person in New Zealand isn't necessarily as left wing as our governments have been, which begs the question, why do we keep electing them? But yeah, it does show me that there's a quite a large silent majority out there who hold views which you'd probably want to say are more right wing than they are left. And now, that's not to say that there isn't still a large proportion of the population who are very left leaning or even liberal. There is certainly a lot more people out there than I think people realize that are more interested in a shift to the right for our country.
And there is a shift worldwide with right wing populist groups because the left have gone so crazy. You've even got some leftists who haven't even changed their way of thinking. They just don't identify as left anymore because the far left have gone so crazy. So there is a resurgence worldwide, and you're right, we are seeing it in New Zealand. We're seeing it in the UK because that country has just gone horrible, and we hope we don't get that bad before things do change. So, what have been your experiences where you're very public about a lot of this stuff, and we just had a prime minister who, during COVID, normalized and encouraged people to report their peers for quote unquote wrong thinking and wrong actions? What have been your experiences?
Mm. I suppose there are many things about what's happening in the UK which you can look at and see here. I mean, obviously the UK is a big issue with them utilizing the police to crack down on such a speech. I've had visits from police for hurting the feelings of TikTok, for example, um, which just it's just an inconvenience more than anything else. It hasn't been deployed in a way which has ever really threatened my liberty in any way. But you have that, and then on top of that, you have interactions with leftists in public, which can be uncomfortable. I recall back in 2020, I think it would have been 2023 now. I attended the Let's Women Speak event. So there was two in 2023. There was this first Let's Women Speak event with Posey Parker. She arrived. A group of trans rights activists showed up and basically just destroyed the entire event, effectively assaulting absolutely everyone that they could get their hands on, or intimidating them to the point which they had to disperse.
Hmm.
And Posey Parker was pretty much close to being crushed in a not too pleasant manner. Anyway, so that's the last that we've seen of Posey Parker in New Zealand, at least as far as I'm aware. But a few months later, the women wanted to hold another event, and so they asked a few guys to come and act as de facto security, you might want to say. And so yeah, I came along. I wanted to stand there, let them do their thing, and just kind of act as a barrier to the trans rights activists who did show up. And fortunately, on this occasion, the police decided to actually do something as well. So there was an extra barrier there. But coming face to face with those trans rights activists, those leftists, some of them wearing like body armor, was absolutely absurd. It kind of wakes you up to just how far gone ideologically some people can get, and that there is quite something that we need to tackle if we are to overcome these differences, if we are to overcome this direction that we've headed as a country. Now, on top of all of that, you then add to the fact that our immigration policy has become very obvious. I mean, in Auckland, less than 50% of the population is European, looks like me. And I mean, for a country which, when my father was born, was 90% looking like me, that is quite a crazy statistic. And so all you have to do now in Auckland is walk around pretty much anywhere. And you, as a New Zealander born here, will feel like a stranger, will feel like a foreigner. And so all of those things added up, you do start to see similarities with the state of the UK and even the US and Canada and so on.
And I think about how we got here when And I think about how we got here. I remember when I was an intermediate and especially high school, it was very common for almost a third or maybe a quarter of the class to be international students who didn't even speak a lot of English. They were from places like South Korea and India, and it then spread into when I was working at retail part time when I was like 19, 20, 21, and we had these Indian families come in with some sort of government program, and this was under national that allowed them to get things like lawnmowers for free because it was supported by the government. And so this has been going on for many years. Of course, Helen Clark, she got away with a lot of this without much scrutiny because the world was a lot different back then, but she's now joined the UN and has been there ever since. And so she's very heavily supported that movement. And John Key, conservative in name only, really. And we're seeing a similar thing now with Christopher Luxon, and it was ramped up under Jacinda Ardern, who supported a lot of these Marxist groups. So she was just like the most obvious example, but this has been going on for years.
Mm. Yeah, and I think this does show a big difference in the approach to politics from the left and the right, I think. Because you will very much have a lot of infiltration of quite radical people within government systems, within our institutions, who will do absolutely everything they can to uplift these movements, these protesters, these radicals that are just roaming our streets. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the general belief of people on the right when it comes to many of the protests that we see overseas is that they're funded by the UN, or that they're funded by very particular individuals amongst the elites to help them uh, actually get away with everything that they're doing and be supplied with all the things that they need. And so, yeah, they're certainly happening to a lesser degree here, but it's not something which is foreign to us. We're very much capable of seeing it.
Yeah, and speaking to what people are seeing, you look at just all the levels of schooling in this country that has some connection to the government, whether it's primary, intermediate, high school, the universities. They are just incredibly Marxist the way that they are run. You've got lecturers in some cases who barely speak English, or if they do, they're not very good at it. You've got uh, students being taught to write thank you letters to the prime minister. I mean, this is Nazi Germany level esque, and it's horrible stuff when you look at it. But the good news is that people are going to wake up and educate themselves and bring themselves out of the system, because that is what is needed. People need to wake up on their own accord, and the more people that have that happen to them in this country in the younger generations, the better the future is.
Yeah, and I think, I'm still young. I'm like, what, 5 to 7 years younger than you? What are you, early 30s?
Yeah,
Yeah, so even at my age, 26, in the 5 years leading up to that point, your brain is developing so much still. Your view of the world is developing so much still. And some of the things that you take for granted have actually quite a stark impact on the way in which you approach life. And so that's very much been uh, kind of the journey I've been going on in recent years. And so, I can go back through videos I made 6 months ago, and I'm like, imagine believing that. So, you know, it's quite fascinating, but I find that it's all because of the nature of the political situation in this country, but in the world, that has led to that. Because when things don't feel quite right, you go and read more, you go and listen more, you go and find different perspectives and see how it can tie back to history, and that radically shifts something within you. And so that's definitely what I've been going through recently, and few of my followers, especially the ones that have been following me for a few years now, would have seen that. Um, but I think that's a good thing, and I'm not alone in that. People much older than me, people younger than me, they'll be doing the exact same thing. As the life that they're living right now just seems a little bit off, and they can't quite put a finger on it.
and looking ahead to the future, what do you think is going to happen politically? Because everybody, when they first start to wake up, hopes for a coalition between pro Western parties that are conservative and they are nationalists, and they're going to fight together against globalists, and it just doesn't happen. And in New Zealand, we're seeing the problems with ACT, and never saw David Seymour as anything special. And 10 years ago, when I started voting, I knew that there were massive problems with National and with John Key's government, but the left was so bad that I just wanted to keep them out of power regardless. And right now, with New Zealand First, we'll get on to Winston Peters later, but it's difficult to see a real strong nationalist group in New Zealand because they're either pushed down, like Liz Gunn and Steve Oliver did get together, but that just hasn't gone anywhere much. And New Zealand Conservative, they have pretty much dissolved fairly quickly. I know people who were part of that party, but I don't know really what happened to them in the end. So, what do you think is the future overall?
Well, I think if there's a political group out there right now, forget about them because no one that currently exists is going to be attractive because they haven't already been attractive. Therefore, it's unlikely that they're going to suddenly become attractive tomorrow. Now, to add to that, I think the biggest issue is a lot of these parties, a lot of these leaders of these parties and those involved, they aren't putting in the full grind 24/7, 3 years of the term. They wait till the start of this year. Like I recently criticized the Conservative Party because they waited until the start of mid-election year to completely rebrand and try and make themselves relevant again. I'm like, no one knows who you are because no one liked you when you were the New Conservatives and no one liked you because of your policy. No one liked you because of who the people running the joint are. They felt absolutely no draw towards you as a party for the most part. And even now, once you've done your rebrand, you're kind of not hitting the points that you need to be hitting if you are to be an attractive political party, particularly to those on the right who you need to be attracting to you. And so parties like the Conservatives in New Zealand, they aren't like I just nothing within me is stirred up. I'm just like I look at their policy and I'm like, okay, I may as well just vote for New Zealand first. They're already in Parliament. The difference between the two policy sets is there, but not dramatic enough to justify a Hail Mary throw at a party that will get 1% at best. And so when it comes to the future, it really is going to be a matter of mass mobilization, in my opinion. It's going to take a lot of communication between people on the right who are very much fed up with everyone, who's fed up with the establishment, who's fed up with National Act, New Zealand First, all of those left wing parties. They're going to be fed up. They're going to go out on the streets. They're going to congregate. They're going to talk. And eventually, they're going to organically uplift particular individuals to lead them to establish something new. And that is ultimately what is going to effectively topple the establishment. That is going to be the change that is needed. But it needs to be organic. You can't force it. And so that's why I see in Britain right now, right? Nigel Farage attempted to manufacture a splitting of the establishment, right? But really, he was the establishment the entire time. Nigel Farage said, "I am the difference. I am what is going to take this country back towards where it needs to go." And then within 12 months of actually being relevant and being the most popular party, he was effectively the Tories again. And there's very little to distinguish between himself and the Tories. But then you got Rupert Lowe, who was actively avoiding becoming a leader, actively avoiding leading the country, leading Britain in the direction they needed to go because he wasn't sure if that was his calling or he wanted to time it right or he wanted to ensure the people were behind him. And would you look at that? The people knew that he was going to be the prime minister in 2029 before he even committed to leading a political party. And that is why he's so organically been able to announce the starting of Restore Britain and immediately 10% in the polls. Reform is really on their heels. They're trying to play. They're honestly they're trying to salvage the messaging and doing a terrible job at it. And so it's going to be the same here in New Zealand. It's going to be the same in Australia. Eventually, one nation will be overthrown by some truly right wing party or movement, and that's just going to be the way of it. The West is sick of liberalism. They're sick of these establishment parties, and they will rally behind the people that they believe can take them somewhere different when that person or when those people become clear to them.
And speaking about Nigel Farage, he has just gotten worse and worse. You mentioned the way he's gone at Rupert Lowe. It's the same way he's gone at Theresa May and Boris Johnson back in the day, Keir Starmer now, and Rupert Lowe is the one who's connecting with the youth. And with Farage, it, it wasn't, was he anti-establishment in a way because he has spent pretty much his entire adult life in the political system. By that definition, you are establishment. But you can be in the establishment and have different views. A lot of people don't get this. So when he pushed heavily for Brexit and was successful, that was a big deal because it was the first major country to leave the EU, which is a horrible, garbage organization. And since then, his stance has been essentially we're okay with immigration, we're not going to limit it or even do mass deportations. We're not going to do that. We're just saying, hey, respect the UK's identity and assimilate. Well, they're not going to, and this has been the case for years. This is why people want a radical conservative nationalist to deport them, and it's just so unfortunate how out of touch he is. What do you think has led to that, and where he's basically not worth voting for? And I don't think he will get any major votes.
I heard an argument. I heard an argument a couple of days ago, and it was that the Tories and Reform are consolidating. The Tories have already accepted their fate that they aren't the big party anymore, and they're aiming for 60 or 70 constituencies in 2029. And then Reform are aware that they will lead the next government if the things stay as they are. And so they're consolidating behind the voters that they've managed to draw across. And who have they drawn across for the most part? Tories, a bunch of moderates who aren't all that interested in remigration or who aren't all that interested in the more hard right policy that a Rupert Lowe is willing to actually do. Being establishment, being very much around politics for decades, Farage has decided to take, well, effectively the coward's way out. He's decided to do the politically correct approach rather than the politically necessary approach. And so he's consolidating as best he can, as many seats as he can, to lead the next government, even if it's a minority government that he needs to rely on support from someone like Restore, because it's more to him about power than it is fixing Britain. And you can hear this just from many of his MPs talking, or many of his members talking. They're not all that worried about immigration. You're like, well, if we're a minority by 2063, I'm dead. So what's it matter? So I think a lot of it speaks to just the intentions behind those involved. They're not actually committed to fixing their country. They're committed to being in charge of the country.
Yeah, that does make sense. And what do you think happened to New Zealand Conservatives? Because they seem to have pretty decent nationalist views, but they didn't really go anywhere. And I've never met Leighton Baker, but he seemed like somebody who could connect with regular people and was quite approachable. He was a big part of the Wellington protests against the COVID tyranny. And I wanted, of course, the party to grow and grow, but they've just sort of disappeared lately. And again, talking about NZ Loyal with Liz Gunn and Steve Oliver, that didn't go anywhere. Unfortunately, it was just too small, which is kind of expected. Small parties, unfortunately, can't get much traction. But it's got to the point where we're just back to New Zealand first, which has its pros and cons. So, what do you think happened with the others?
Yeah, I don't know. I never paid enough attention to, the New Zealand Conservatives or Leighton, to be fair. Like obviously I'm aware of Leighton. I was aware of Chantel down at the protest in Wellington, but beyond that, I haven't paid an awful amount of attention. I know in 2023 he tried to do his own thing with the Leighton Baker Party, Leighton Baker Park Party. But yeah, I don't know where he's at politically, and the direction that the Conservatives have taken since then is very, I think, just generally unappealing. It's probably appealing to some people within the freedom movement, but it doesn't have much legs. It's very civic nationalist, if you want to even call it civic nationalist. There's not a mention of immigration on their website from what I saw a couple of weeks ago. And as a party, they are very moderate. Um, you'd even want to say libertarian. Um, Not like there's conservatism there. So yeah, there's somewhere between conservative and libertarian really as a party right now. So yeah, I can't say what happened to them. I can't say what's really going on with Leighton, but yeah.
Moving on to Winston Peters, what do you make of him? Because I've never actually voted for him because when John Key was in power and I saw a lot of issues with him, I didn't know what I know now, obviously, but Winston every month was basically making a name for himself, talking about how he was unfair to the poor, how he was discriminating against Maoris, even though none of that was true. And key in one of his many moderate moves was actually just blocking a lot of the loopholes in the welfare system, which is very easy to get into in New Zealand. And Peters was just constantly criticizing him non-stop, and then he is the one who allowed Jacinda Ardern to get into power, which is something that's almost reprehensible to me. It's almost unforgivable. But now that he's got more of a position and he is speaking up against Maoris who are just treating the system like a joke, they're not showing up, they're just showing utter disdain for the system, and he's looking to abolish the Maori seats. That is a very ballsy move by him, and I understand he was more critical of Jacinda Ardern moving forward, but he is the one who allowed that to happen in the first place. So I, of course, am very supportive of anyone who is genuine when it comes to helping New Zealand, and I understand he has a greater voice than any of the other guys we just mentioned. But just because of his history and some of the things that he has done, I just don't know what to make of him right now. What do you think?
I think if he's committed to it now, so let's say come election night, we have formation of a three-way coalition, and the Nationals already announced that it's on board with abolishing them. I think in that situation, they are gone. I think in that situation, it will just be a done deal. It'll be a matter of a referendum, and they'll be gone by the 2032 or 33 election, depending on what we do regarding 4-year terms. And so that's a positive. But, I don't know how much pressure Winston will actually put on National to agree to it in the coalition negotiations. I think we could very much get a similar situation with the Treaty Principles Bill at the previous election, where we'll agree to it up until the first reading, and then we're just going to let it die. And so, at least with that, both NZ First and National could technically hide behind NZ First alternative to the Treaty Principles Bill, which has gone nowhere because Paul Goldsmith was put in charge of it stupidly, and they're dragging the chain. They're trying to not do it as much as they possibly can, trying to avoid it. And so, if the referendum to abolish the Māori seats ends up in that situation, it's never happening. At least not under any of these guys, which means it's going to take a more radical populist movement on the right to actually get it done. But I also think it will create interesting conditions in society if that happens, because you will get more people from the Te Pāti Māori crowd attending protests. They will be a little bit more feral, I will say. I was at the activation when they announced that they were going to have their own political system or their own parliament or whatever. I was at that activation and covered it. And, there are people on there who already don't like me. And so I was threatened by one. And so if that's a measure, I think they will be far more willing in this situation where their political power will quite literally be taken away from them to be a little bit less friendly. And so I think that could really mix things up if all three members of the coalition agree to it and want to get it done.
Yeah, and it's going to be very interesting as far as what the coalition does, and if they do put this through. First of all, it's going to be a monumental moment in the history of our country because, number one, it's going to spark outrage worldwide. Like, you saw the viral coverage, that little feel-good protest moment that they had, that little performance the MPs had. It's going to be like that times 10 if they put this through. So when it gets a vote, it's going to be very interesting. And the thing is, they've gone full mask off. They want to be completely separate from the system that we have, and it's going to split their entire base. Like, I was at the pro-Palestine march last year, the biggest one they had, and there were a group of mostly Maoris protesting in favor of not just Israel, but also saying we don't want to be a part of this pro-Palestine march, talking about the connections it has to Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and the entire movement that the Ayatollah created decades ago. So it's going to create massive separation within their own base. And so I don't think this is going to go anywhere. I think they're just going to upset a lot of people. But again, if they vote on it and it goes through, very interesting.
Yeah, well, it was more just on the whole what the coalition should actually do now that New Zealand First has proposed this policy. And it was one thing that I did mention. I was arguing that every single member of the coalition should come out before the election and support it. They should make it the number one issue of the actual election campaign, because we all know that it's the popular choice. It's the popular thing to do. If you make it a key element of the election campaign where you know if you vote for this coalition, they're all behind it, then you're going to shut out the left. You're going to shut out Labour. The Labour's not going to be a haven, because they know here's our opportunity to get rid of these crazy radical Māori party seats, and even some of the seats that Labour would typically grab, and make a quite a significant electoral change now. I think that we can survive another 3 years of this economic situation under National if we just stick with them and get this done. And then after that, we can reassess. So I think it would be a smart play for every one of the coalition members to get behind it and make it a key election issue.
And last thing on Winston Peters before we move on, what do you think is likely to happen as far as him on remigration? Because I don't think he has that kind of attitude. Again, he's been a chameleon over his years, siding with the people who are now trying to leave Parliament, and he, of all people, is the one saying, okay, you want to leave? I'll help you leave. So I don't know what his position in the long run is going to be. He is from a far different time than the rest of us, and with remigration, I just don't see that as a focus of his, which is a focus of the New Zealanders of our generations and the ones that are coming after us. But I think it's going to be somebody who is younger and more in tune with that movement because, again, he just grew up in a different time. So, and as far as what he did after he allowed Jacinda Ardern to become the Prime Minister, again, he was against COVID, but by that point he had left her coalition, so it wasn't really like he was taking a big stand against her. And again, he allowed this to happen in the first place. So I don't know what to make of him in the long run. I've got my hesitations that it could end up being like a bit of a Nigel Farage situation. What do you think?
I think there's three shades of Winston. There is the I'm in government Winston, which is I'm fully locked in on my portfolios and I'll talk to you in the election campaign. There is the election campaign Winston, which is just guns blazing. He'll make it very, very clear what he's campaigning on, and that's going to be the focus. And then there is the opposition Winston, which is far less common because he's usually booted out of Parliament entirely when he has those opportunities. But I don't see Winston being like too staunch in his rhetoric against the UN, but obviously I am aware that the party generally has a it needs to be within our interest type approach to globalist bodies like the UN and so on. But you did mention remigration, whether Winston would get behind it. I don't think Winston would, and I think Winston is closer to a civic nationalist than he is like let's say a guy like me. But fun fact about Shane Jones, and this took me by surprise. I don't know the circumstance of why he follows this particular account, but he follows the Remigration New Zealand Twitter account, which was quite something to learn. Now, this might have just been Remigration posted something he agreed with and he followed them. I don't know. It's probably not going to mean much in the grand scheme of things, but Shane Jones, listening to enough of him, he is the sort of guy who does seem like he would prefer to maintain a certain cultural identity within this country to an extent that goes beyond what you might see from a Winston Peters, who takes it a little bit more of a, well, he is very much just focused on appealing to what the voters want more than really going out of his way to push his own ideas.
One thing I do want to get your opinion on, because you did a video on it several years ago, and it's going to be quite relevant for future generations and the current ones. So it's good to be in touch with it. Is mental health. You did a video on a member of the youth parliament standing up and talking about how the government wasn't doing anything. I remember almost 10 years ago when I was at university, one of the ones that Jacinda Ardern campaigned at, she did the whole political performance because they laid out the shoes to represent people who had taken their own lives. And it's something which, for years, I believe the government should 100% stay out of because they're not good on it, to put it mildly. But they are involved, and it's an increasing problem throughout the world, particularly in the West. So you're quite in touch with this issue and how it's affecting a lot of young people. Could you comment on it?
So yeah, I barely remember the video. It was that
Ah,
long ago now, but that's fine. Um, but I can't say I've seen all that much change with our mental health system since I haven't read anything. I haven't really seen anything to give me much hope. I mean, there was this whole Mike King Gumboot Friday thing to help with, getting people some counseling. But, I think Mike King has his own interest at heart there. I don't think he actually cares all that much, or at least he's extremely bipolar. I know people's experiences with him are very mixed for a reason. And yeah, I don't really trust the guy. But yeah, I can't say that this country's ever really done the whole mental health thing very well. I don't think they deal with it very well. I was in the mental health system for a while as a teenager, and I dealt with like the Which was like the child mental health provider, and like they were able to give me some counseling, but they couldn't really do much, right? In fact, if anything, these sorts of institutions, these sorts of providers often can just exacerbate the problem by putting you on things like SSRIs, and that really messes with your head, especially when you're young. And so I think the broader problem with mental health is even if you have counseling, they don't actually have any solutions. They just have a bunch of pills to throw at you, and they hope that you get better, but you're probably not because these things that they give you don't actually understand how your brain works. They don't actually understand what the real issue is. And so it's not treating anything, it's numbing it down. It's especially if you're going on and off certain drugs, it just messes you up. Really, that's all I can say. And so this mental health system in New Zealand messes you up rather than heals you. And I think that's why we have such a big problem.
yeah, and going back to my early 20s, I knew that the system was extremely flawed because I had the doctor that I had seen since I was a kid recommending surgery that wasn't needed, and it would have affected the rest of my life if I had taken it. So it's one of those situations where, again, even before COVID, I knew the government shouldn't be involved. So when it comes to something like mental health, when every chemist has antidepressants on their shelves, and we know who's recommending those, especially the doctors who didn't speak up against what the government was recommending during COVID. They just went along with it or forced it down our throats. So I again feel that this is something that the government should stay well out of, and there are people in the private sector who can handle it much better than they can. What do you think about that, since you have personal experiences with this particular part of the system?
I think that governments should work in conjunction with the private sector to deliver results because I firmly believe that the government isn't the best equipped to cater to absolutely every need through taxpayers' dollars and their own provision of infrastructure and medications and support and all of that stuff. So it really does need to be a good, strong relationship between the private sector in a range of different areas, not just this one. And so, yeah, that's the approach I would take. But I also agree with you regarding a lot of the stuff that they do, which relates to youth mental health and other things related to youth, be it education and so on. A lot of it is trying to appeal to younger people to come vote for them when the time comes. And so even me, when I was 17, I was 17 when Winston went with Labour, for example, right? And I was watching on TV and I was like, yeah, I kind of want Winston to go with Labour was my thinking. because Labour was selling a big game about mental health. They were selling a big game about a few other things. And that was more attractive to me. I never really liked National because I saw them as a little bit fake. At this point, I was just young, naive, and very liberal. And so, you know, it was exactly that. They attracted me in, they drew me in with policy that was relevant to me as someone in my age and my situation. And I very quickly learned how silly that was.
Yeah. Well, I was a supporter of Labour as well when I was a kid because my entire family was pro-establishment and, for the most part, very liberal. So, yeah, we had similar experiences there. And over time, I went through that red pill phase, and I was supportive of the National Party. But now I see that we don't have a situation where there's like a Maloney in Italy or a Trump in America or a Malay in Argentina. We don't really have a strong conservative party. So I guess what I would like to know from you is what would you have the government involved in? Because in my experience, the government is just terrible at everything. So if I had my way, we would get a Malayan who acts as like 80% of what the government is involved in domestically. And I understand that's not for everybody, but that's what I've come to over time. What would you have the government involved in if you had your way?
Yeah, so I've been very chop and changey on this in recent times, but I feel like I would Javier Malay a lot, but at the same time, I would ensure that the involvement in the areas that they are taking charge of is very strong. Not necessarily in terms of regulation, because I don't think over regulation's overly effective. But I feel like the areas in which the government takes control of, they need to do it very, very well. And so they need to utilize whatever is available to them to get the best possible results. Because I firmly believe that when it comes to freedom, whilst you do want or you do need the government to back off a little bit in order to ultimately retain and then have a sense of freedom in your life, you also need the conditions in which you're living, the environment, the society, and the systems to work in a way that actually maintains that freedom. Because if they get all topsy turvy, if they're inconsistent, that really impacts you. That makes you feel trapped or like the walls are closing in. And so I think it's a fine balance between deregulating the shit out of things that just don't need to be regulated, abolishing a bunch of ministries that simply aren't needed, combining a bunch of ministries if there's some merit to them, but ultimately you can do away with a lot of the fluff. And then making sure that you execute and focus on the performance of each of those ministries very closely and ensuring that they deliver the best results. That's how I would approach it.
And moving on to a bigger topic, which is a major focus on my channel, and you've done videos about this Marxism, where it came from, the countries that were behind it, and who is still influencing it now to this day. About 8, 9 years ago, the leader of the Green Party admitted publicly, when she didn't need to, but she just had no shame, that she had abused the welfare system when she was studying. And we've had Gori Zaganahan of the Green Party taking pictures with the ANC. I think it was around a similar time, 7, 8, 9 years ago. And it was a guy who was part of these policies that are discriminating against white people. So these people have just been absolute scumbags for years, and it's just getting worse and worse now with Chloe Swarbrick being the latest addition. What do you make of these scandals as you report on them? And it's just the same as usual, but it's just getting more blatant.
Yeah, so the scandals, I think, go to show the way in which leftists view the world is very complex because they can have as many scandals as they want, and their firm leftist Marxist base will be unwavering in their support. That's what shocks me because you won't find that on the right. You'll find people who have the most minor of indiscretions on the right be ostracized by their voters. You're like, you're out, you're gone. We don't care about you anymore. The more liberal you get, the more leftist you get, the less likely that is to happen because there is such a degree of ideological capture. And that's why I think the Green Party have been quite careful in their approach. I mean, to those of us on the right, it's very, very apparent how radical they are. But to the average liberal, to the average Labour voter, even they aren't actually all that aware of just how crazy and how dangerous the ideology of the Green Party is. And so this is why I think the Green Party, they are openly Marxist without stating it. If you know what a Marxist sounds like, you can tell that they're openly Marxist. If you don't, you'll think that they sound a little bit more liberal and rational, because that is the way in which the Overton window has been placed and how it's shifted in the last few decades, where the Green Party has just upped their rhetoric ever so slightly year on year, where they've become more and more radical, and openly so. And now they definitely do peddle, Marxist and cultural Marxist talking points far more openly. But again, you have to be able to spot it. A lot of people have no idea what Marxism is, and they even have a even less of an understanding of what cultural Marxism is, where it's linked, where it started, why it exists, how the left operates, how the left draws in such big crowds. And so if people don't have an understanding of this, they're never really going to understand the threat and the danger of parties like the Greens, and how what seems to be insignificant photo shoots or meetings and interactions with parties like the ANC, how much more of a warning that should actually provide than I think people are aware.
And that is, in my opinion, the biggest problem moving forward with the truth and the conservative movement as a whole. They don't understand the dangers and the threats that these Marxist groups not only face with how they radicalize so many people, but who they work with. That they go to actual communist countries, Marxist Leninist movements that started from the ground up and took over the entire government and are still ruining things to this day. They coordinate directly with these countries. You've got Maoism all over the West in the form of feminism. You've got Marxist Leninists pushing this anti-imperialism from the West. Meanwhile, they're making their military moves and they're pushing for a radical overthrowing of Western governments. And it will make it easy for Russia and China to take over, which is, again, a major focus of my channel. So what do you think is the solution to this, and how have you observed this? Because you've become quite aware of this early on, whereas with me, one of the biggest issues that I wish I had realized a lot earlier is that a lot of the truth community, they didn't actually name communism and communist countries that had started with Leninism and built from Marxist movements as the enemy. They just would call it globalism, but they wouldn't, again, specify these Marxist movements and where they originated from and the countries that have been built from them. So what do you see as the solution to this, and just what are your observations of the Marxist movement, how big it is, how it's growing, and the history in general?
Well, I think the history of Marxism is quite fascinating, as in, like, one of the biggest examples that we always rely on is the USSR, the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution. But I think we probably pass a little bit too much blame on Russia, to be fair, with respect to communism, because it was the communist movements, the almost cells, you could say, within Central Europe, which pulled enough strings and found their way into well, let's say the Soviet Union, prior to it being the Union, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, and managed to get the country into a position where all of these exiled Marxists and communists were able to flood in, topple the Tsar, and then ultimately have a revolution. And that's including the likes of Lenin, who was able to come back through after the Tsar had a few too many communists whisper in his ear. And so, I think it's communism, Marxism in general within Central Europe really saw the situation in Russia, saw that they were weak, saw that they honestly needed leadership. And so the people were crying out for a voice to come and save them. And so they used that, and they used the Russians as a testing pot. And they're like, okay, you're a petri dish. We're going to see how this goes. Let's initiate this revolution. Bang, let's do it. But at the same time, you've got China, who is in a similar situation. They're kind of hopeless. They're not doing anything. They're going nowhere. They're poor. They've got a lack of leadership, I suppose, but there's nothing much going on there. And so you've got all these political parties in China, and you've got the political parties that Mao involved himself in. And so you find you're in the middle of Soviet Russia in the early 1920s, and all of a sudden Soviet Russia and the Nationalist Party that Mao's involved with, that Mao's on the payroll on, are communicating, are cooperating. And so all of a sudden China's now been exposed to Marxism. China has now got these insights from this powerful but deadly ideology and power in Europe. That's right next door as well. And so, would you look at that, within a few decades, communist China is born. So it's a fascinating history.
It is, and the biggest thing I wish I could change right now in the truth community and a lot of these big channels is, instead of this ridiculous and nonsensical revisionist history when it comes to World War II and the Nazis, we replace that with people talking about the Marxist movements and communism and how they both originate and how they've spread, because you see it right now in South Africa. That is a Marxist-Leninist movement with the ANC, and look what's happening to the country. You see it with China, you see it with North Korea, and just it's so many countries. We've seen it with Latin America now more than ever because of what Trump and Rubio are doing. And instead of these Marxist movements being built up in our schools thanks to cultural Marxism, we need to abolish that completely and teach people this is what you have to avoid from early on. We need to get people to realize as kids that these Marxist movements, whether you're on the left or the right, are extremely dangerous. Like, I see that a lot of right wingers who don't read beyond headlines and they don't actually do a lot of studying, they are just as prone as the leftists to being indoctrinated into Marxist movements because they want to radicalize the movement and take over the government and have this massive revolution where everything's going to be distributed to the people, exactly what the Bolsheviks did with the Tsar. So that is a massive problem, but the education system, it's so flawed and it needs to go, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I'm very much a abolish the Ministry of Education on day one type guy. It needs to just be completely rebuilt from the ground up. That's the only way to really get rid of Marxism, is to destroy everything it touches. But as hypothetically as you can do that, I suppose. Figuratively, you could do that. But yeah, it needs to come down. It needs to be rebuilt, and you need to teach people about the history from a I don't even know. I don't even want to say a more nuanced way, just in a way that's accurate as far as I'm concerned. And there'll be a lot of people that debate the accuracy of it. I was like, I don't care. How about we teach people what is right, instead of saying that what's right is rather subjective.
Yeah, of course, everybody is going to say that. I mean, Jacinda Ardern was just the most blatant with that kind of manipulation. She said, "We will be your greatest source of truth." So, thankfully, a lot of people have woken up to that. But just the mere fact that it had to get there for people to realize how flawed the system is and how corrupt it is, you know, we just wish it didn't have to get to that point. But yeah, moving on to again what our actual solutions are, a lot of right wingers, they need to know this, and maybe they don't want to know it. Maybe they have been corrupted. Maybe they've been co-opted. Who knows? I think a lot of them are being influenced and possibly paid by a lot of these groups. You don't succeed by tearing down the system and replacing it with one that's going to divvy up everything to the people. I mean, that's what the Bolsheviks promised, and what did Lenin do, and what did Stalin do after that, and what did the system as a whole do? The rest is history, and we don't want that. I mean, that's what happened again when Mao won the civil war against the Chinese nationalists. You can't break down the system and put in a perfect system that is void of corruption. It's a nice fantasy thought, but it's never going to happen. You need to improve the system from within. That's how we succeed.
You need to bring them with you, is the approach that I take with it. you can, to be fair, you can have a revolution that is, for the most part, non-violent. And I'll say for the most part because there'll always be the people that fight back. But you can make radical changes which are the equivalent of revolution. But so long as the people have taken you there, you're not forcing it upon them. The results, the outcomes, the systems which are put in place in its stead, they will function. They will not crumble. They'll still have separation of powers. They'll still have accountability. They will still function, and they will still ultimately be in the interest of the people rather than what the Marxist revolutions have been, which has been to use the people to gain power and then exploit the people for their own benefit.
And that is how it usually works the vast majority of the time. Sometimes it can work out for the better, but most of the time, when you've got a big country with a big population in particular, it never works out well. Even if it was designed with good intentions by those who led the revolution, when they succeed and the system doesn't do well for most people, they don't change because they're benefiting regardless. So, looking ahead, because it's that particular year, what do you think is going to happen with the election? Because so many normal people, normal voters, were so disgruntled, so disheartened, and so let down by Jacinda Ardern and her horrible tyranny that it was natural the Conservatives were going to get back in with National, but they've been making decisions that are along the same lines, and people are waking up more and more because the immigration has gotten just more and more blatant. Again, kind of similar to what it's been like in the UK. It's gotten worse and worse and worse, and now it's just gotten times 10 under Keir Starmer. More people are waking up, and he's now historically unpopular. A similar thing to a lesser degree is going to happen in New Zealand, but I think it's mostly going to be business as usual. And I don't know what kind of coalition would be successful to win the election.
So I think there's what's likely to happen this year and what I think should happen, what would be the best possible outcome. Best possible outcome within the realm of actual possibility, I should say. And so I think what will happen is that the polling as it is now will shift a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 points in any direction for any party. And so maybe a 15% New Zealand first is on the horizon. But what I want to happen, what I think should happen, the best possible situation is that National Party voters decide, you know what, stuff it. Let's give 10% to NZ first. Because right now, with the way the polling is, if 10% of all voters switch from National to NZ first, there's a very close battle there for who will be leading the coalition government. And so I think if people want to really try something different while still within kind of general realm of what we've expected of governments for the last few decades, then they will give that a go. I also say this to people who are worried about NZ First going with Labour. Well, if you ensure that NZ First has more votes than National, there's no way in hell they go with Labour because they would be giving up leading the country. So there's always that to consider. But what I think will happen is not much difference. What I think should happen, what I think we need to see happen for the sake of damage mitigation, is have NZ First have as much power within the next government as possible.
Yeah. Prime Minister Winston Peters, wouldn't that be something?
Good standoff too.